we okay? Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody here in the room at the LSE and online. My name is Mick. I've been associated with Critique for 50 years. Whose 50th anniversary we're commemorating, celebrating this morning. Hillel, who was in many ways was the founder, will speak. But I thought I might just make a few of my own reflections at the time, very briefly. This morning I managed to find Critique 1 and Critique 2, collector's items now. And one or two things struck me looking through the first few issues of Critique 1 and 2, through to number 6 for the moment, which took us over about 3 years. It came out quite regularly, which was really quite a remarkable feat, given our resource base was quite low. I mean, obviously, firstly, as Hillel will point out, the Critique started in Glasgow, where nearly all of us met one way or another as graduates, postgraduates, doing various bits of research, postgraduate work. And there we met Hillel in the Institute of what was then called Soviet and East European Studies, whose main figure at the time, of course, was Alex No, who himself had a long association with the Russian Revolution, came out of the Menshevik tradition. And the Critique evolved, really, I'd almost say, Hillel, in the coffee room in the Institute at the time, where we used to sit around forever and ever and ever arguing about the nature of the Soviet Union and how to characterize it. And that's, in many ways, how the discussion began. I looked through the very first critique, and it was very interesting just doing that briefly. First of all, to see what a wide range of people wrote for it and were associated with it and remain so. Some remained connected, some did not. One of our first advisory editorial boards, for instance, included Paul Sweezy, Ernest Mandel. Some of our early speakers included a very wide range of people from both Eastern Europe and from the West, including, by the way, Ernest Mandel and Ralph Miliband spoke at one of our conferences. In fact, before Critique came out, the first Critique published in spring 1973, we had already held 2 conferences, and it was called Radical Conferences of Socialist Scholars, Soviet Eastern Europe, with which I was involved in, Hillel and others at the time, some of who are online today or will join us at some point. The first conference, just to give you the background and history, really, was held in Glasgow. That was held on January 1972, if you can remember back then. And we did it on the Russian Revolution. It was a kind of analysis of the Russian Revolution, different views of the Russian Revolution, and away from very different perspectives of the Russian Revolution. And some of those papers appeared in a later edition of Critique. In fact, one of the papers by a guy called James White was actually on the historiography of the Russian Revolution. And Jimmy, as he was called, wasn't exactly entirely on our side, but nonetheless, we tried to be a broad church, if you know what I mean. Our second conference, which was really extraordinarily successful, I remember it very well, was held in London, Hillel, I don't know if you can remember, in October 1972. And we had about 400 people came to the conference, which gives you an idea of what the times were like. Over 400 came to the conference. I think we held it at University College London, I can't quite remember where. And again, it's quite interesting to look at some of the main speakers at the time. This will bring back tears to your eyes. Ernest Mandel was there, Yuri Pelikan from the Czech opposition, who was now in exile, Ralph Miliband, and of course certain people from Critique itself. So we started really as a group of students with Hillel and others in Glasgow, and then moved to create the conference. And then, having created the conference in 72, moved to create Critique 1 in the spring of 1973. Just to remind you, you probably know this anyway, Hillel, but just for people here, it contained about 4 or 5 articles, one by Hillel Ticktin, just to give you an idea. That was actually the first article in the journal, called Workers' Councils in Czechoslovakia, following on from 68 and what happened there afterwards. Then there was Hillel's, but let's call it the seminal article on Towards the Political Economy of the USSR, where Hillel laid out the first view and theory, which became the critique theory of the Soviet Union. And Hillel will speak to that, I'm not going to. Then there was Jimmy White, who was a historian at Glasgow at the time, who wrote on the historiography of the Russian Revolution. And again, an old friend of ours, David Rubin, who wrote on Godelier's Marxism. There was a series of book reviews as well. I did a book review, actually, I didn't realize I'd forgotten all about it, which was also on the Congress of the Toilers of the East, which was held in 1920, when Zinoviev made a major, rather extraordinary speech. Actually, in the book review section there, just to give you some background, again, I don't want to go on that too long. Tamara Deutsch did a very good and interesting review of the work of Victor Serge, Year One of the Revolution, which was very, 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 very interesting indeed. I'm not going to go on too much longer here now. I just want to give some of that background. We did try to be, and hopefully remain, open. If you look at the people who came onto the board, they didn't all agree with us, indeed, as you know, although Paul Sweezy remained friendly. Nonetheless, given he was very much oriented towards China at the time, they didn't quite agree with our particular view. We tried to draw in as many academics at the time and as many students at the time as well. And as you can see from those numbers who came to the October 72 conference, over 400, it does give you a flavour of the time and the sense of, you know, the dynamics of the time as well. Much missed, I think, much changed. So that's just a bit of background. I just wanted to fit in. I was part of that, but I wasn't only Hillel, was there a whole group of other people. A guy called David Law, who wrote a PhD on the left opposition, others who wrote on Ukraine, the workers' opposition, and many, many others. Too numerous to mention, so I won't mention them. So Hillel, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background on how it came into being. I haven't talked about what you wrote, how you wrote, why you arrived at the views that you did. So I'll leave that over to you. So Hillel, I'll hand it over to you to give us the view and how you came to the critique view. Hillel.
Well, thank you. Yes, I think you've given a fair introduction, which I can add to, in fact, and I've got a couple of critiques here. The first issue came out, I think, in 73. It's 50 years since then, and the issue itself had a series of articles already mentioned up to a point by Mick. The article I wrote there, which was on the effectively on the political economy of the Soviet Union, was actually referred to 2 or 3 years ago by someone whom I don't know in the Soviet Union in terms of the present opposition within Russia today. The article I wrote, in other words, which describes the nature, the theoretical nature of the underpinning of the Soviet Union of the time. So it's interesting that that critique continues to the present day in that sense, which of course is what it intended. And I think it's true of many of the other articles. It just happens that in critique number 1, I was the article I wrote happens to have been read today, which surprised me. Anyway, to actually return to the proper topic, the meeting Mick referred to had, I think he said 400, I thought it was 500, and it was quite extensive in the kind of people who actually attended it, in different currents and all the rest. At that time, the views that critique was putting forward and still put forward were quite different from the rest of the left. And it's much more on that I will concentrate. The Institute itself was, well, is an interesting department to actually describe. Insofar as the professor in charge, who'd been appointed relatively late in terms of its actual existence. That's to say, it had come into existence quite a few years before. He was appointed in 63. That's Alec Nove. And Nove himself did his best to adapt to whatever was necessary to adapt to effectively. That's to say, he came from a Menshevik background. His parents were Mensheviks who were exiled in the 20s, and he had adapted to more or less, I suppose, a derivative of Menshevikism, that is to the kind of viewpoint of the Labour Party. Not that he was militant about his politics at all. However, the point behind it is of course that Nove was crucial in trying to, well, I'm not clear of the word, hold back or not appreciate our actual development. He eventually couldn't stand it, in fact, and resigned as head of the department. And when he turned 65, he had to retire. And when Gorbachev came to power, I think he actually met him, and the two got on very well. It would appear, which gives you some idea of the background of the Institute itself, which we were in. The other members of the department were actually varied, including one member who had escaped from the Soviet Union in the 70s. It's not 70s, sorry, in the middle 30s, or at the time of the purges, or just before the purges, and remained a kind of fairly loyal entity, one could say, in not wanting to thoroughly criticize the Soviet Union itself. He obviously he was in the Institute, and he was in Britain, and he had escaped effectively from the Soviet Union, and eventually found his way to Britain and to a job. His wife went back to East Germany at one point after he died, and really that's kind of where he stood, somewhere in the middle. I remember him saying that I think he was present in 1934 at the Congress, which was held in Russia and in the Soviet Union at that time, the regular meeting of the party. or irregular meeting of the party. And he said that not everything had been revealed. That is after, of course, Khrushchev.
The person you're talking about was Rudolf Schlesinger, wasn't it, Hillel?
Yes, you told her.
Yeah, you didn't mention his name. That's quite important. It was,
No, you're quite right.
Sorry,
Yeah,
he was
right.
one of the
Thanks.
of the journal.
Yes, he was talking about Rudolf Schlesinger. Yeah. Anyway, the point is that in the Institute, you had a range of viewpoints with him effectively some kind of a critical supporter of the Soviet Union as it had developed. He refused to talk to me because I was so critical of the Soviet Union. When I actually came to the Institute, he made it his job to come and speak to me, and then decided I was a lost cause, which would indicate, of course, where he actually stood. He died in 1969, so there was only I overlapped with him by only 4 years. So of course, he would have been a very interesting person to have been able to talk to in some detail. Anyway, the point is that there were a number of people, including Jack Miller, who was the de facto kind of head before Nove became that, and who had belonged to the Communist Party in Britain and actually gone to the Soviet Union in 1939, amazingly enough. This is at a time when Rudolf Schlesinger had already escaped from the Soviet Union. Rather interesting that they were together in one department, as it were. But that was the nature of the department. The department, in other words, was not left-wing. It was somewhere in the center, which is what, of course, what Nove would have wanted, and the other two that I've mentioned would also have wanted. There were a few other people, but they were more or less secondary. In 1970, there was a change when quite a few people came from Canada with a background of parents who had left the Soviet Union or had left Russia and gone to Canada. And the period, you notice, was a period which began in roughly 1963 in the United States with a move to the left. And in 1968, of course, you had the demonstrations in Paris. So students in general tended to move to the left, which was a sharp difference from what existed before. And of course, a sharp difference what happened afterwards, which was roughly 65, 66, it began to change back again. But in this period, which Mick was talking about, it's 70 to 75 or so, the students tended to be left-wing, far left-wing, in fact. Bogdan Kravchenko was one of the most important who came over. And of course, he's still around. Would have been it would have been nice to have him here as it were to give the further detail. Anyway, the point is that students then came to the Institute, which they hadn't before. I think when Mick came, there were 3 students. And from there actually developed this attempt to get an alternative understanding of the Soviet Union, which wasn't simplistic, let's say, either saying it was the worst entity that had ever entered the universe, worse than any atomic bomb. Of course, it was pretty awful, but that kind of approach didn't try and analyze what it was and why it was so awful. So it ranged from the attitude ranged from that, which was very much like the much of what came from the United States at the time, and from various exiles from the Soviet Union as well. So it ranged from that to a viewpoint which, of course, more or less worshipped the Soviet Union in the various, usually in the various communist parties. And what became clear, I think, to the students, apart from myself, was that what was required was something different, something which did really analyze the society. And it wasn't a society which could last very long. And it had to come to an end. We didn't know exactly when or what, but fairly quickly, as it were. I think somebody wrote that I had said this, that the Soviet Union, this is during this period from 70 to 90, during this, I suppose from the 60s as well, the late 60s as well, I'd said the Soviet Union couldn't possibly last and would be coming to an end fairly soon. And one author actually said that I'd written that 13 times somewhere or other. Well, I can't remember exactly where I wrote it, but to me it appeared obvious. And it was very difficult at the time to put that across. And I saw that as part of what we were doing. That's to say, what we were trying to do was to genuinely analyze the Soviet Union, where it came from, what really happened, and why it couldn't possibly last, which of course we know turned out to be true 30 years after the event, when it actually came to an end. What is true is the enormous contrast one gets between the Soviet Union coming to an end in 1991, officially coming to an end, 1991, when it simply comes to an end, finished, the majority walk out. Exactly what that meant isn't very clear even today, because the fact is there was a vote a couple of months before they decided to call it total quits, where the votes were actually for continuing the Soviet Union, but of course in a new form. But that didn't happen. It simply crumbled and fell to pieces. And of course, it's interesting that today, again, we have polls or a firm actually investigating what the attitude of the population was. And I think in 2018, there was a poll before, as well, but in 2018, something like 2/3 of the population wanted to go back to the Soviet Union. That's this Russia today, 2/3 actually want to go back to the Soviet Union, which might give you the wrong impression of what the Soviet Union was like, as it were, if one simply said that. But that's the reality. So I'm citing this in order to indicate the complexity of the nature of the Soviet Union itself. But also, and as I indicated in the beginning, the Soviet Union, for the majority of its inhabitants, when I was living there, which was from 61 to 65, and of course I got married there, which made it, of course, from that point of view, much easier to understand the society. I say that because when I first met my wife, I was shocked, really, by how critical she was of the Soviet Union. And she just took that for granted. Everybody I spoke to who weren't in my confidence, and of course she knew I wasn't going to give her away, everybody else proclaimed effectively their loyalty and how wonderful the Soviet Union was. And the interesting thing about that, which most people didn't understand, and it took me at least 2 years to understand, was that it was a necessity for everybody in the Soviet Union to proclaim that they loved the Soviet Union and that they were not going to act against it, etc., etc., etc. But this was far worse than any dictatorship which had ever existed in that, just in that respect. I'm not saying that it's far worse than the total, was which did this, that, or the other. But in this respect, it was so total because, of course, to get on, to exist, and to avoid making the wrong steps or saying the wrong thing, it meant that everybody had to adapt to it, and to adapt to it properly so that you didn't make a mistake at the wrong time, or weren't or said something while you were not thinking properly, or whatever. In order to avoid that, you really had to ensure that some part of you really did believe it, even if when you left the country, you could relax. And the result was that the population in general, while at one fundamental level knew that the system was not functioning in a way which was necessary to get the loyalty of the inhabitants, the full loyalty of the inhabitants, and it was not functioning simply in order to provide the necessities of life sufficiently quickly, and it was not functioning simply in getting workers to work with some sort of conscience over their work. Most people, when working, really didn't care tuppence what happened to what they were doing. And their attitude in terms of work was worse than any other country. That's to say, they didn't like working. That's to say, I'm talking about everyday work, the work of the majority of the population. Obviously, a scientist can get to love his work in some sort of sense. Somebody who is deeply involved with it can remain deeply involved with it. And that, of course, is what happened to scientists. That would become their reason for life, as it were. The extremity of the forms of control, in other words, were very much part of the system. And of course, that was true throughout. I very much remember how when I left the Soviet Union, I was told by somebody, and obviously belonged to the secret police, who said, don't tell anybody what you've seen. He actually said that to me. Don't tell anybody what you've seen. In other words, the everyday life is not something that you can tell the rest of the world. You mustn't, please don't do it. We didn't say please, it just said don't do it. And that was the nature of their society. The secret police was absolutely central to the system. And of course, a considerable number of people, as we know, were jailed. But it was far worse than that in the earlier period when we, I think the number is 12 million people were actually killed. Now, the reversal of that attitude which took place under Khrushchev wasn't maintained in the way Khrushchev had it originally bring in. Obviously, if what you do is reveal that the regime has killed something, he didn't give the statistic actually of 12 million people, but of course the population knew of what it was like. If it had continued like that, it would have been somewhat different, but it didn't. He was removed. It's interesting that he was removed, of course, and I think it's regarded, from this point of view, he would have been regarded as a liability to, in 1963. I was there at the time when he left, and I remember well. When he left, there were crowds going to Red Square, talking to each other, which was a first. The first time people were able to speak to one another like that since the early 20s. You didn't really have to be a genius to see that this couldn't last, because it didn't really have any basis to last. They weren't introducing any kind of democratic form. It just didn't exist at all. And the whole system was a hierarchical one in which the elite were privileged. They really were privileged. They were supplied with their own, they were given supplies daily almost, quite separately from the rest of the population. There was a separate hospital, etc., etc. There's no question it was a governing elite which stood over the rest of the population. But at the same time, it wasn't an elite which was there because their parents had money, or even because their parents had contacts necessarily, although certainly in the later years that would have helped. The situation was that the people who entered the elite had managed to do so by particular contacts, by knowing how to act in a way which maintained the system, etc. And you didn't have to be a genius to work out that that kind of system can't last. So they didn't really have an incentive system for the majority of the population. Obviously, the incentive for the elite was to try and maintain themselves in power. But it was very difficult, given that, of course, the majority, even if they couldn't express their discontent, were discontented, and they knew it. So what you had was an unelected elite, which wasn't there because it had money. It wasn't there because their parents were necessarily there, though it could happen, particularly in the later years. It was a separate elite which quite obviously were in trouble. And Khrushchev, of course, knew that. And he did change, and they would have had to go further towards something of an elective system. But they weren't able to do it. Or they were worried under Khrushchev, the rest of the elite, or the actual government. And consequently, they removed him. He understood, of course, what had happened, and knew that he couldn't really revolt against it. Molotov, of course, had been removed by him, and Molotov was sent to the Far East and then came back to Russia. I actually, one day, in walking in one of the main streets, I almost bumped into him. I was walking along a pavement. He was walking along the opposite pavement. And it was very interesting to see somebody who had survived from the beginning, which was itself surprising, walking with his wife, who looked awful. I mean, her face looked awful, but she looked a product of the camps. Well, she, of course, had been jailed, and he said he couldn't protect her. I think it was 6 years, 8 years. Anyway, the point is to indicate the understanding of the Soviet Union could not really be developed within the Soviet Union itself, simply because of the controls and the possibility that whatever you did would actually leak out. Even if you took extreme precautions, eventually somebody would know, and that would report. People were always afraid of that. And while some people might write on a piece of paper and show to no one, Clearly the majority didn't. The consequence was that there wasn't an analysis of what really existed. There wasn't even a half analysis of what existed. And what transpired after it came to an end, after 1991, was a kind of blank on the genuine nature of the Soviet Union. And the analysis in general on the part of standard literature has been superficial, very superficial. The very fact that one could guess such a society existing for over 70 years ought to be examined in great detail. Of course, there were people who managed to survive, very few, but they did. And they obviously could describe their experiences, but the theory of what actually happened is another matter. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it does require a separate and penetrating analysis of the whole period and why it could come into existence in that extreme form. And then, as I said, one didn't have to be a genius to work out that it would come to an end, and why I said that quite quickly after I reckoned I could say it, as it were, in 1970 onwards. But I don't think there were all that many people who thought I was saying anything which bore a possibility of being true, but it turned out to be true very quickly. Anyway, the point behind all this is that the analysis, the full analysis, detailed analysis, and a theoretical position as to where it stands has still to be properly written. Because from our point of view, we have to show how this is part of the transitional period. And one of the issues of critique there is a discussion of what one talk about when talking about transition. Sorry. I don't know what that is. In other words, what I'm saying is that the theoretical analysis of the possibility of something like the Soviet Union has still to be written. The detail can be written. Individual parts of the system can be described, but to understand how it developed, why it came to an end, requires a much more profound analysis. Obviously, I've tried to do bits of it, but I can't say that I've gone too far with it. Clearly, any discussion of the nature of the Soviet Union has to involve the nature of the transition period itself, the nature of the period that we are living through. Unless one simply argues that what exists is capitalism, and capitalism is here and will be here until the end of time, and which some people argue, some people even argue in terms of the market, going back to the beginning of humanity. Well, obviously we don't subscribe to that viewpoint, which as far as I can see is simply nonsense. But it is obviously the interest of the ruling class within capitalism to argue that capitalism is eternal and that capitalism can provide everything that is required. Well, it's quite clear that it can't. Today we have a situation where in the third world, which is something like 2/3 of the world itself, the population is in considerable trouble, simply in terms of everyday life, that's to say, in terms of getting adequate and correct food, the correct kind of food, and having proper housing, and having education, etc., etc. It's quite clear that that is the case, and that it has in fact got worse in the recent period. Population has reached 8 billion. When the Soviet Union came into existence, the global population was between 2 and 3 billion. So the population has increased very considerably. And it's clear that a change is required for the population of the world as a whole. Obviously, if all you're thinking about is your own particular comfort and you live in, as a middle-class person in the developed world, you can shut your eyes to it, although it doesn't look quite the same today. The fact is that the right or the ruling class did decide to reverse things in 1980. And whereas in the immediate period before in Britain, the range of income between the worker and the person in charge was something like 12 times. Today it's between 200 and 600 times. So, and at the same time, if we look at the state of the economy, the global economy or the British economy, the US economy, it is effectively static. What we had was a boom of that kind in which the ruling class managed to give itself a lot of money, which it was able to extend itself, as it were, to a limited degree, in which it tried to build up further entities. And of course, today we have 5 basic firms which play a crucial role within the world economy. The argument in terms of competition looks very weak now, as opposed to earlier times. After the 1980s, when this kind of propaganda was that the society would simply go onwards and upwards. In fact, for most people, it didn't. And for a substantial proportion of the population in America, the lower middle class simply lost out. And it's, of course, since the crash between 2006, 2008 in the United States, which went right around the world, the global economy has been mired in a mess. It has been growing at a very slow rate, if it was growing at all. Quite obviously, it didn't grow during the period of the epidemic, but it doesn't look like it's going to change from what it was before the epidemic to something else. But it's clear, even to sections of the ruling class, and it's clear in America, that they have to do something about it. That's to say, the discontent in the majority of the population has to be assuaged. The fact that, as I just said, the majority of the global population is in considerable trouble with their income, with obtaining enough to eat, etc., is clear. I think the ruling class is aware of this, but we don't really have any measures to have any change. At the moment, what it looks like is that the ruling class is split. This is quite obvious in the United States. And again, if we look at Britain, the way the Conservative Party has split apart itself, it shows that the way forward is not at all clear to the ruling class, even if they want to maintain themselves as that ruling class. Of course, the argument as to where we are was put forward as indicated in 1917, that we're living in a transition period. It's a period. That doesn't say the transition is actually being successful. It just says that it is a period. And it's clear that the kind of transition that Marx talked of is not taking place. One could argue that in some sense, underneath what exists, it is. That's to say, the means of production are actually developing, even if a lot slower than they could have if you had a socialist society. But it is limited. You have a high level of discontent, of course, within the population as a whole, and the interest of many people that work in improving their work, of course, is much less than it could be. In other words, the transition period is a period of decline, but what is also supposed to be is a period of real change towards a more successful society, towards a socialist society, in one word. And while the underpinnings of that are developing insofar as the economy, the means of production are actually developing very considerably, but not as fast as it would if the society was built of a kind where it was able to provide the resources for it and the goals which were actually required in order to develop that society for the majority of the population. So we are effectively in this period, and it has demonstrably shown that it is in a period of decline today. I say that because the United States has, of course, clearly been growing and has acted as a kind of alternative when anybody said, well, we're in a period of decline, say, look at the United States. But you look at the United States today, it's hard to say that it's in a period of going onwards and upwards. While the growth rate, well, of course, wasn't anything to write about during the period of 1920 to now. 2020 to the present. But with the epidemic or pandemic having gone or on its way out, one would have one could anticipate the reverse. In fact, what was proclaimed in the earlier years of the turn out of the epidemic, it has in fact not been able to continue that hope of building society on a new level, which was effectively what was being proclaimed at one time. The society remains stuck at low growth levels. Of course, this is particularly true of Britain, where the de facto growth rate is close to zero or negative. And it's clearly a country itself in decline. Well, one might expect a country which, after all, was a leading country, the dominant country before 1920, and to some degree until fairly recently. One would expect that it would go into this kind of decline unless it tries to take real steps forward which go beyond capitalism, which obviously it isn't going to do in this immediate period, because the forces for socialism at the moment appear to be almost as weak as one would not want. That's to say, we see a large number of strikes, which hopefully are an indication of change. And there are indications of change, but that's as far as it goes. I would expect those indications of change to actually develop, but it looks like it'll take some time. One would hope that it won't take quite as long as might be thought, because the fact is there is no revolutionary socialist party of any extent or depth today. The end of the communist parties would appear to have not led to the building up of a genuine socialist party which acted as a real opposition to the bourgeoisie itself. However, I think we can say that it is inevitable that it will actually develop, although I personally almost certainly will not be here. But I think we can expect it to be developing. We can see the trends. We can see that although the last 30 years have not been a step forward, that step forward is lying in the wait, as it were, at the present time. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got quite a few people online and we've got a few people in the room. So I wonder if I could, there's a bit of an echo. Sorry, can you hear me now?
No.
Can you stop the echo?
Can't.
Hello? That's better.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Could I just add a couple of points, Hillel, very briefly, to the origin of critique and people who were involved in it, who I think deserve a mention. You touched on a number of those. 2 or 3 general points I made, but I mean, one is clearly the origin of critique, apart from your own work, theory, and arguments, which of course were very much derived from having lived in the Soviet Union. And I think that needs to be stressed, the very fact that you'd lived there for a period of time, absorbed the society, understood it from within, rather than the general theorization of it from without. I think that was really crucial. But I think also, and you mentioned this, the change in the nature of students from the late 60s and into the 1970s. It's doubtful, it seems to me, that without you, critique would ever have come into being with the particular view that it had and developed. On the other hand, I think without that kind of wave, if that's the right word, of surge of new students coming in the 60s and early 1970s into the Institute, with certain views about the world, the nature of the world, it's very difficult to think that critique would have gone very much further than it did, it seems to me. Now, I'm not just talking about myself, of course. You mentioned a number who came from Canada, Bogdan Trevchenko particularly brought a number of very important people through. I'd also mentioned Susie Weissman, who went on to write a biography of Victor Serge, And again, Don Filzer, who did work on the nature of the Soviet working class, which was really quite important. I mentioned Dave Law, who did very good work on the history of the left oppositions. Another guy who sadly I haven't seen for a very long time called Sandy Smith, who did a lot of work on the economics and of agriculture. There was, in other words, a very large number of people. Ian is here today, you know, at the beginning, who did form a mass of people, or a critical mass of people. I think, again, as well as your own work, of course, that was very critical. And something like critique could not come to being today, I don't think, in the same way. The other thing is I'd like to also say something about very quickly, so I don't want to go on for too long. You talked about the origin of Soviet studies itself in Glasgow. It's very interesting if you go back and look at the two founders of Soviet studies. Not that we were part of Soviet studies in some ways, as you indicated, Hillel. We were very critical of both what Jack Miller had been writing over the years, and particularly, of course, Rudolf Schlesinger, whom you mentioned. Schlesinger was a remarkable figure, but born in Austria, just managed to get out of Nazi-occupied Europe in the late 1930s, came to Britain, and with Jack Miller established what was then the Journal of Soviet Studies. They were quite open. I mean, Jack Miller, who I met once or twice, obviously, I think he was clearly a member of the party at the time, and later on, of course, he changed. Rudolf Schlesinger, I don't think ever left the party, really. I mean, I think he was not the Communist Party, but the wider sense of the CPSU. I mean, I don't think he ever wanted to leave. I think he was expelled, was always looking for a way back in. But his writings were really quite crucial in defining what Soviet studies was in that early period. I see Paul Fleurs is here. Paul would know something about this as well. It's quite interesting to see who wrote in the early Soviet studies and who associated themselves with it. I mentioned 2 or 3 names. One was Morris Gold, the Cambridge Communist Party economist, who was a big supporter of Soviet studies, as indeed, by the way, was E.H. Carr, who was then beginning of his work on the early Soviet revolution. And again, I think the role of Carr in Soviet studies more generally is one I think we recognize today, or I would. Hillel, we might be very critical of much about Carr, but he was really quite important. The other third person was very different to Dog and very different to Carr, of course, was Isaac Deutscher. And Isaac, Tamara definitely did write, obviously did write for the Soviets, for critique. I don't think Isaac ever did, but nonetheless, Isaac Deutscher did write a very interesting article in Soviet Studies in 1955, which was an attack on E.H. Carr, who was, by the way, his close friend. But all I'm trying to do is give a kind of general feeling of what it was like within Soviet studies and the framework within which critique then, you know, could come into development in the 1960s and 70s. Whether it could have come into being at the LSE, which was dominated by very different kinds of people, or whether even at Birmingham, I don't know, but Glasgow was a framework at least. One other people I just want to mention, I do think need mentioning, just by way of record, I think Mandel, you know, Ernst Mandel, I mean, if you look back, I mean, he wrote for critique, I mean, he didn't necessarily have to agree with it, and he spoke at our conferences pretty regularly. He was open to debate. He was very much open to debate at the time, and you know, his passing, I think, was a huge loss. And although, I mean, you didn't agree with him a lot, and he obviously did not agree with you, and obviously notions of the workers' state, however degenerate, it was not the view that we held. Nonetheless, it was at least testimony to Mandela, I think, to make the point that he was open to that kind of discussion. As indeed was, and a person who quite came to have forgotten in all, was Peter Sedgwick. Somebody who also needs to be remembered at an occasion like this. Peter, of course, was a great interpreter of Victor Serge and brought his writings to an English-speaking audience, and he was on the board for a period of time of critique, and he was very open as well. So I just want to mention those very, very, very general things by way of the origins, the history, because it can get lost. But I think it. By the way, somebody later on, Hillel, you might be interested to hear this. When I arrived in Glasgow, nearly the first thing I did in 1969 was to attend Rudolf Schlesinger's funeral it was assumed that we'd all go. In fact, we all went to Rudolf Schlesinger's funeral, which was on Hellersburg. Directly opposite, very interestingly, the nuclear submarine base, which he was most annoyed about, I was told. I mean, it's rather formidable why. So, yeah, it was a very, very interesting place to join. The other thing I'd mention, Hillel, you didn't, I mean, I know in a sense, the notion of the role of the exile in a debate about Soviet studies as well, I think was very crucial at the time. No, in a way, was an exile. You know, it was an exile from the Russian Revolution. He was a parliamentarian, although it evolved basically a social democrat in essence. But there were many others at the Institute at the time and in other places who were kind of exiles from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. I mentioned Yuri Pelikan. There were a number of others, even Zeleny, and a number of others who played a role as well. So I just wanted to mention that. So look, those are just a few additional comments, just by way of background, to add to what you said earlier on. I should also mention David Hillel Rubin, who was very important in critique, Scott Meikle, who was very, very important at that time as well. I hope I haven't left anybody out. No doubt I have. If I have, I apologize in advance. So why don't we open it up for questions from the floor here, and then questions from the online. So who would like to go first? Anybody wants to go? Yeah, please begin. Yeah. It's Paul fluent. Paul? Yeah. It's working. Is that working? Is it working? Okay. No? Can we press the button? Press the button, as they say. Right. Is it working? No. Why don't you come up, Paul? Why don't we just come up here? Yeah. Come up here. This is the Paul first.
Oh, yeah. I first came across Critique magazine when I was a supporter of the now defunct and gone in very strange directions, the remnants of it, the Revolutionary Communist Party, who were the only group on the left to take Hillel's ideas seriously and actually to adopt them. And we did actually produce a book, which I suppose the author is somewhat embarrassed by now, Frank Fried's Soviet Union Demystified, which was very much based on Hillel's ideas. It's sad, I think, that the left hasn't taken up Hillel's analysis on the Soviet Union at all seriously. It hasn't really engaged in it. You see the reviews of Hillel's writings and that engagement in them, they just don't seem to understand the basis of what Hillel was writing. And the left still clings largely to the analyses which were evolved at a time when the Soviet Union was quite new, and therefore the analyses were very provisional. The bureaucratic collectivist or the state capitalist analyses, which saw the Soviet Union as a new mode of production, not a socialist one, but a new mode of production in parallel with capitalism, or the standard Trotskyist analysis, which was that it was a workers' state at heart, economically, with a parasitic bureaucracy, which is a strange thing for Marxists to argue that base and superstructure are two entirely different things. The problem with the bureaucratic collectivist state capitalist analysis is that they don't provide any investigation or satisfactory investigation of the laws of motion of the society. And also, when you look at events leading up to 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and in China, where you see the reversion to the market, the question of longevity. It was a mode of production. It didn't exactly last very long. I mean, I've lived longer than the Soviet Union did. You know, I mean, you were born in 1970. When from 1929, when the first 5-year plan, which brought in Soviet social economic formation to 1991, is 62 years, which I unfortunately now exceed. But yeah, but I think the Hillel's analysis does serve as a basis for a very good understanding of the Soviet Union how it came into existence, the historical accident, and how it didn't form a new mode of production, but nevertheless was a form of society which did endure. And actually, I sometimes think Hillel's underestimates the achievements of Stalinism. Yes, it was barbaric in a lot of ways, especially in the Stalin period and the Mao period in China. There was terrible wasteful resources and horrendously inhumane. But nevertheless, we had in both societies, both in Stalin, Soviet Union and Mao's China, an incredible advance from what were largely agrarian, backward, ill-educated societies to very much educated and industrialized societies, notwithstanding the definite faults and problems involved in the economies and societies as a whole. Therefore, I come to conclude that what Stalinism was basically a non-market form of modernisation for a big backward country, specific to that period. It was, as I said, an historical accident, and I don't think we'll see it again, because it needed a large country with massive human and material resources, and a leadership which was willing to engage in this form of modernisation, often blundering into it, as Stalin certainly did, and willing to suppress all opposition, including people like ourselves, in the way of carrying it out. The thing is that this modernisation programme can only exist for a while. It has to be worked through the market if the elitists to stay in control. Now, I think that the Soviet elite left it far too late. If it had gone for the market, instead of tinkering around with legal reforms, they've gone for much further, more fundamental market reforms in the 1960s, it might have been in a much better condition 30 years later to have reverted to the market fully. So in China, they actually reverted to the market within about 30 years of 40 years of seizing power, and they've actually done incredibly well. Go back 50 years, would anyone have thought that China would be the second biggest economy in the world, and a capitalist one at that, still under the aegis of the Communist Party? Anyway, I'll leave it at that, and say great thanks to Hillel for his analysis, which I think has enriched thinking on the question of what Stalinism was and what the Soviet Union was. I think we all owe a debt to Hillel for thinking these things through in the first place.
Thank you. Okay, that's from Paul. Anybody else from the floor here who would like to say something? Yeah, please do. Hi there. Just say who you are. So.
Yeah, Brian Green. Maiden name Hillel, as in Hillel Ticktin as well. South African too. I treasure what critique has done. It helped form the ideas and the theory which I think I've developed beyond critique. I disagree with everybody who says that the USSR wasn't a mode of production. It was a mode of production. Karl Marx is pretty clear on this issue. A mode of production is identified by the form, the manner in which the labour of the individual becomes part of the labour of society, and the way that labour is appropriated. If you follow those two guidelines, then you come to the conclusion that most definitely the Soviet Union was a mode of production, specific, unique, and very short-lived, because of the contradiction between the socialized nature of production and exploitation. You can't have the socialization of production amidst exploitation. Once you have exploitation, you have margins. Once you have margins, you can't have a pricing system. You can't have a profit motive in a socialized system, because once you monopolize labor time, and once labor time is socialized, any improvement in efficiency and then the reduction in labor time immediately causes you to appropriate a smaller section of the total labour time of societies, and therefore we have duplication instead of innovation in the Soviet Union. So all the characteristics can be seen. I'll leave it at that. Perhaps we can debate the issue much further later on, but I have to say thank you very much. Without critique, I don't think I would be standing here today.
Made you the man you are.
It may be the theory.
That's okay. The positions. Anybody else would like to make a contribution? Anybody else from the floor? Yeah? No? What's all, Ian? One friend critique. You say, sorry, that is a bit weird. Just
You can come round here, so you'll see you better.
Oh, okay, come around there. Sorry about this technology.
Better.
Okay, Ian, you just introduce yourself.
Ian Spencer, former student of Hillel Ticktin. The importance of critique for me personally was the decisive break with any kind of residual Stalinism. I'd studied previously under Jeff Kay at City University, who began that process. But the decisive break with Stalinism was to study with people like Hillel and Mick, who were able to bring the importance of an understanding of Trotsky, but without it ever being treated as scripture. The importance of a proper theoretical perspective, which was subjected to a decisive critique from the left. And that was important in so many ways. Hillel and Searchlight South Africa's critique of South Africa was a good case in point. But the question I wanted to ask was about the protracted nature of the coming into being of the proletariat as a class for itself, how that seems to be something which is increasingly difficult. We've seen attempts on the part of workers' parties to kind of combine together on a kind of left social democratic kind of perspective. I'm thinking here of Syriza or Podemos, and how they've ended up being abject failures. And it seems to me that the only recourse we have now is to say that there are no compromises and that we have to stick to a rigorously scientific use of Marx's method to understand the present. After all, however critical one might be, and that's what Lenin did. The fact that Lenin wrote the development of capitalism in Russia was an important part of his development of the Bolshevik Party. So the question is, what do you see as the possibilities of developing a political movement of the left, even if it's just at the moment the slow, painstaking building up of a theoretical base? Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Anybody else? Is there anybody from coming online? Yeah, from online, if you could just, okay. Sorry, it's a bit slow, but we're doing our best. Who is it?
It's Mike McNair. Can you open your?
Say who it is?
Yeah, Mike.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, hold on.
Hold on.
Yeah,
Yeah, we can hear you. We can
Just
hear you.
wait.
you can hear me. Okay, that's fine. I thank you, Ellen. I agree that the work of critique has been of very considerable importance in understanding it. It's a circumstance in which the overwhelming majority, I look at it rather than from the standpoint of ex-official communists, of ex-Trotskyists, that the overwhelming majority of the Trotskyist left thought that the Soviet Union was a phenomenon analogous to the Restoration in England in 1660 to 1688, or the Restoration in France in 1815 to 1830, and that therefore the social conquests of the Soviet Union could not be overthrown without a full-dress counter-revolution and reconquest. And in consequence, in spite of the fact that Trotsky was perfectly clear that the Soviet Union was not a formation which could last for any length of time, that's utterly clear in Trotsky. The post-war Trotskyists all thought that it was some sort of a permanent change in the social order, and Critique had the Hillel's work, and Critique had the enormous strength of getting that right. I had 3 comments in relation to the contributions which have been made from the floor. In relation to Paul Fluer's, I think it's important to grasp in relation to China that the forces of production in China were massively greater than the forces of production in pre-revolutionary Russia. Pre-revolutionary Russia is characterized by a peasant agriculture, which is that equivalent to the European early Middle Ages, not to the European late Middle Ages. The population density is massively lower, the underlying productivity of agriculture is massively lower, etc., etc., etc. So that while it's true that the Chinese bureaucracy didn't fall into believing the lies that the Chicago economists told them, it's also the case that they were in a very much stronger position to make a cold transition to capitalism. But I don't think they've yet actually succeeded in doing so. It's still the case that there's a very substantial state sector, and it's still the case that protest in China takes the classic Stalinist form of appealing to the good bureaucrat against the bad bureaucrat, rather than creating permanent trade union organizations or anything of the sort. Secondly, in relation to Brian Greene's point, I think the point of the concept of a mode of production only makes sense as in the framework of a stadial conception of history. It's useful to think of antiquity as a mode of production. It's useful to think of feudalism as a mode of production. It's not useful to think of Calvin's Geneva as a mode of production. It's only useful to think of the Crusader states as a mode of production, insofar as the Crusader states attempt briefly and unsuccessfully to instantiate the West European feudal mode of production. The third point is in relation to, I'm sorry, I missed who was just speaking. Dear me, I can't remember who it was who made the third point. The suggestion that Syriza and these other organizations represent organizing on a left social democratic basis is, in my opinion, mistaken. What they represent, Syriza is perfectly clear that it was the core of Syriza, and the fundamental politics of it is the old Euro-communist tendency in the Greek, that the Greek KKE split between the Euro-communists and the Orthodox Stalinists, and the Euro-communists become Syriza. Podemos has at its core the same conception. And I think there's an extraordinarily strong tendency for the far left to imagine that Stalinism has gone away because of the collapse of the Soviet regime, whereas the reality, Stalinism in the workers' movement remains a politically dominant tendency. And this is reflected in this country in the politics of Corbynism and the failure of the Corbyn movement because of its commitment to the People's Front conception. That's it.
Thanks, Mike. That was great. I think we could take some other contributions from people online. Please put your hand up. It'd be great if you could come in. Anybody else to come in there?
There's a question
From?
online from.
You read it out now. Who's it from? Hi there. Who's it?
Dr. Mehmet Ali Dirkadem, do you want to speak or shall I read your question?
Sorry? You speaking to me?
No, not you.
No, just I have no urge to speak. I'm more in a listening mode. But my question is a variation on the theme of Isaac Deutscher, please.
We'll read it out anyway.
Okay, so didn't Lenin do a little trick when the Bolsheviks overlooked the period?
That's not a, sorry. That's not a question. That's just a little
What's the
comment. My question, which I formulated to you, was the work of Isaac Deutscher relevant to the critique mission? You know, and how relevant is it today for developing a theory of the dissolution of the USSR?
Okay, thanks. That's a much more direct question than Lenin doing a jig.
Lenin doing a jig was not a question. It was it was
Okay.
me continuing my levity.
No, I think levity is a very good thing in this day and age. Do we have any more questions from online? We've had two interesting questions so far. The Deutsche question I'd like to have a go at. If you don't mind, Hillel will too, I know.
No, thank you very much.
Right. Thanks.
Maybe you comment on these and someone.
Well, Hillel, you've got a lot of things there to respond to.
Oh, you want me to?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I can't pick up what you and so forth are actually saying at the other end. Okay, yes, to respond to. Yeah, okay, since the last thing was Isaac Deutscher. I met his wife, who I don't know if you noticed what the comment she made. She basically embraced what I said, which surprised me, since Deutscher's attitude was more reformist, I thought, in relation to what is actually what actually occurred. In fact, I've written to that effect. His conception of the Soviet Union after the changes which took place after Stalin's death was to actually almost to regard them as having reformed sufficiently, or having reformed with more reforms being possible, which surprised me. But I think he didn't really understand what was happening in the Soviet Union. His wife actually praised me for what I was saying. I didn't say anything about Isaac Deutscher, of course, but at the meeting, I actually met her in her house. She obviously liked what I was saying, so I don't know if there was any connection or is any connection. So perhaps I'm judging Isaac Deutscher too awfully or something. But my impression of Isaac Deutscher is that he didn't understand what was happening in the Soviet Union and what had happened. He was critical, obviously, at some level, but if you look at what he actually wrote during the war and afterwards, I certainly would be very critical of Isaac Deutscher. That isn't to say I don't like his other things he wrote. Regarding the various people mentioned, I did meet Morris Dobb on one occasion, and of course met Mandel a number of times. I couldn't agree with either of them. I think the nature of the Soviet Union in both their eyes, although they were very different, was much better than it actually was, both in terms of the everyday life of ordinary people and in terms of the programs which actually were being used. I don't think people realized the depths to which the Soviet leaders had actually gone. And the fact was that even after Khrushchev was replaced, quite a few people suffered in whatever form, being jailed or losing their jobs. Or, of course, there was a kind of revolt as well, so people were killed. So it's very difficult to actually save the reputations of these people, I think. I don't think E.H. Carr understood the Soviet Union at all. When reading his obviously work before the purges, I don't think he really did understand that it's useful for its detail, but it's limited very limited in its understanding of what was really happening. In regard to Mandel, well, Mandel was a reformist of a kind. Let's say we're looking at the Soviet Union, but he seemed to have different viewpoints at different times. When I first met him, and in fact I spoke in Berlin at a conference which he was the main speaker. I think there were about 3,000 people present. And at the time, he seemed to pick up what I was saying, or just to say, we appear to agree. But he seemed to have reverted later to a greater acceptance of the nature of the Soviet Union. That's a positive acceptance. While he was critical in the standard kind of what became a standard Trotskyist viewpoint of saying that what existed was undemocratic, etc., but there were important reforms, and it was a step towards socialism. It wasn't a step towards socialism, as well, of course, that we can see it today very obviously. It wasn't. It was the reverse. And it may well be that we look at the effects of it, the way it made people turn to the other side, whether through reading or because they were involved in the various operations of Trotskyist groups. It, in fact, also tended to hold back the world. Not that it was the crucial element, it wasn't, but what is being required is a full criticism of the whole nature of Stalinism on the one hand, and a clear alternative, and a clear alternative of how we must try and get there. And part of the problem with many Trotskyist groups is that it's not a problem of Trotskyism, it's a problem of Trotskyist groups, is they very quickly become possessive of whatever they've managed to achieve, or whatever arguments they produce, they remain with them to the end of their lives without seeing what the critiques could be. However, in general, in my view, Trotsky was correct. Not every word that he said was correct, and what he argued before 1917 was actually dubious. But the Trotskyist groups, in my understanding, are in fact a step forward, even if they, many of them don't know quite what they're saying or where they're going. Anyway, obviously it's complex. The question of transition period, mode of production, etc., which was raised, and modernization. It's very hard to say that in the 1930s, when millions were killed, when the nature of of what was actually built in industry was produced, that's to say, it tended to fall to pieces. When so many people didn't have enough to eat, it's very hard to say that there was any kind of progress there. One has to say the exact reverse. You can't say that. So, okay, if we take we're leaving out the war, which one can also argue as to what they ought to have done at the beginning of the war, the Second World War. In the period after 1945, again, the fact is the purges reappeared. And if we look at what was being built, well, yes, they got the atomic bomb, and they used atomic power and so forth. That is true, and industry was built. But if you actually look at that industry and what it ought to have been, there's a big difference. Leaving aside the fact that it was no joy being a Soviet worker, leaving aside that the whole system was one which was the opposite of development, and it was very difficult for ordinary people. Clearly, that was very, very true on Stalin. It was less true after Stalin, after the reforms of Khrushchev. But again, if you actually look at it, assuming that we leave out the question of purges and people being jailed for criticizing or whatever, if you actually look at the nature of their industry, it was relatively, I don't know if the word is backward, but it was certainly at a lower level than the same industry in the West. It was less developed or less properly developed, etc. I have to say, I went around at least one factory, and I was amazed by the crudity of it. The problem there wasn't only the nature of the system, it was the relative lack of resources. That's to say, processed resources that they actually had. Of course, they had the minerals which you could dig out, but you had to bring them. You had to dig them out and change them, etc. The system was inefficient to a degree which is unbelievable. And it's not surprising that it was, given the nature of that regime. It's very difficult to talk of them being a kind of economy which gave some sort of lesson to the world in growth, or was the best that could be done with growth. It wasn't. It was almost the exact reverse. Growth was a lot lower than it ought to have been and would have been, even in a capitalist, well, especially in a capitalist framework. Of course, it would be below what it would be in a socialist framework, but it was very much below what existed in the West, and that was because of the total lack of interest in actually working. And let's say people had an automatic feeling of opposition. They would work as slowly as possible and often as poorly as possible. this isn't a question of psychology. You only have to read the amount of time taken to build something or whatever, to realize and what they do first and what they do last, to realize that the nature of the system itself tended to make it more backward and tended to make it slower and tended to put it in a position where it couldn't compete with the West. But it was obviously true it couldn't compete with the West. I think everybody knows the Soviet car, well, it just wasn't a success in the West. And they ended up importing the Fiat. That's to say, importing the parts of the Fiat where the Fiat or aspects of the Fiat where they built a car. So you can't separate the failure of the system and the actual nature of production. In this case, the forces of production, as they were being developed, were not socialist forms, and they couldn't operate a fully capitalist form either, and partly because of lack of resources, and partly because the system itself wasn't, I was to say, wasn't liked. People didn't, again, the word isn't appreciate, but people inherently found the system itself difficult to cope with, if you want to be nice about it. Otherwise, you have to say that the system itself simply didn't work. People were obviously critical of the system itself and consequently didn't excuse it. On the one hand, you couldn't stand up in a empty space and make a speech criticizing what existed without actually attacking the system. You couldn't do that, even that. You certainly couldn't stand up and criticize the system. And that was true, and it meant, of course, that what ought to have been there wasn't there in terms of examining what existed and what the alternatives were, how it ought to be done, what people should have got for whatever. The result was that obviously everybody in one sense was discontented. They wanted something else, something better. And under Khrushchev, it did get easier. I remember being surprised when I went to a cafe to have a meal, and this was quite soon after I arrived in '61. And there was a number of workers close to me, and they were discussing how the work should be done. And when I asked a question or whatever, they said, "Look, we know perfectly well what's wrong," and it was true. They did, and what they didn't know was how to change it. Well, how would you change it except with a revolution? And yes, so I don't think you can talk of the actual development of forces production very much. It depended exactly what you're talking about. Undoubtedly, they got an atomic bomb, and they did build as we can see now, what's happening in Ukraine with their atomic power, and how the invader in the Ukraine's trying to capture them. And what's interesting is just how many instances there are of that kind, and how many they actually did erect. It's true. They did use atomic power. The problem was, of course, you need more than atomic power. It was simply easier to put up power stations than to do the same thing as existed in the West. The problem is that the Soviet Union, in one sense, wasn't a system. That's to say, it didn't have the interrelationships which a system does, and which consequently tends to improve what actually exists. What exists in the Soviet Union was something which most people realized, whether they opposed the system or not, or whether they thought they opposed it or not, or whether they officially liked it, what was a system that most people realized didn't work. It was hard to think anything else, given the way it had actually developed. And by, of course, by the 80s, that was very, very evident, the late 70s. Remember, what happened in the Soviet Union was that what everyone calls them, the section of the party to the right of what's his name in 63 took power. They removed him, and they then went for a stronger system, stronger, in other words, in arresting people, in imposing penalties, etc., etc. It took them 2 or 3 years after Khrushchev was replaced to get some sort of formula, which then, for a few years, became a clampdown on the Soviet Union itself. And I'm referring to that period. In the late 70s, it more or less cracked. And of course, by 1980, you had a mass strike of the mine workers, a very considerable strike, lasted a couple of years. And that was an indication the system was finished, that the system or non-system was finished. And of course, there were then the Federal Secretary died, was replaced, and he died. Several died. Anyway, the upshot, of course, was you got a reformist who effectively lost control. But the point being that the Soviet Union was unstable from one end to another, and that in its actual production, it had difficulty producing high quality goods at all. And that was its nature. So unfortunately, from any kind of point of view. Well, in terms of how you define it, one can't define it as a worker state. In no sense was it in the interest of the workers, and the workers weren't in power. How were the workers in power? There was no election. There was no attempt. The people who were in power were much better paid and received more favors, many more favors than ordinary people. It's true they couldn't pass on their position to their children. It was unstable in that sense. But in no sense was that a worker state. It was, insofar as there was a benefit, it was for those in direct power. For the rest of the population, it was very difficult. Someone said I underestimated the achievements of the USSR. Well, I don't think it's true. What achievements? You're not going to say it was an achievement in the 20s. In the 1930s and early 40s are known for the imprisonment and killing officially of 12 million people. I think Solzhenitsyn talks of 40 million people being affected. I don't know quite the number, but the number of people who killed was enormous. It's very hard to talk of achievements of the USSR under those circumstances. Under those circumstances, what achievements? And in knowing how to kill people quickly. Even that I would doubt. And if you remember, there's a memoir or book about the killing of the Trotskyists, and I think it was in 1935. They took them out in a horse-drawn craft. The people in the Trotskyists who were in this prison, or it was in the countryside, and they took them, picked them up, put them in the necessary, gave them the necessary wheels, as it were, and then took them to a hole which had been dug and shot them, put them in the hole, and then the driver drove off. The driver was a Trotskyist and survived. That would have been typical of whatever they did, except that was an extreme example of the nature of the system itself. It is very hard to take a positive view of the Soviet Union, given the way there was this mass killing, and that continued. Under Khrushchev, of course, he brought it out, though not all the detail, but he brought it out. But there continued to be what amounts to an injustice right down to the 1980s. That is the reality. Obviously, it depended where you lived. If you were an official living in Moscow, chances are you were safe. What would happen on farms outside you, we just don't know. It's hard to talk of the achievements of the Soviet Union. The only sense in which it is achievement is to say that it's possible to have an entity which is not the market. I say that as well because some people are now arguing that the Soviet Union was also a market. Well, that's kind of crazy, but it's the kind of thing the right needs. That's to say, they need to be able to say that the market is here and is eternal, that it has existed from the beginning of humanity and will until its end. That's just nonsense. But that is part of the reason why some people, not usually left wing, do argue in these terms. Well, I'm much more optimistic, having been so pessimistic, as it were. I'm not a pessimist, in fact. The fact is the Soviet Union came to an end. It's true, I expected it to come to an end, and I lay no claim to knowing anything about that. It wasn't difficult to see it. And of course, I wasn't the only one. But to be able to see that it couldn't possibly last. But that doesn't mean that the world itself isn't changing. And I think in terms of trying to understand the world, we should understand the Soviet Union in the context of the world as a whole, and what now exists in Russia, and what could come out of it, and what could be learned, what could be used in changing our society into a society for humanity and not a society for some people in humanity. I think we are on the path. Of course, that's the argument from 1917. But I think it's clear that the forces of production today have reached a super level where everyone could have a higher standard of living. That wasn't true 50 years ago. It is true today that it's possible to develop the means of production, the food which we need to eat, etc., so that everyone has a high standard of living. I think that's clear. So the possibility is there in a way it didn't seem quite so obvious in 1917, even if, of course, that was the belief of Lenin, Trotsky, and others. I think we are at a turning point at the moment. Now, turning points can last a long time. But of course, it's true that the number of countries where there is any kind of strong, genuine socialist party is very small indeed. It's probably zero. But it's interesting, one hears that China's beginning to change, though where it's going to go is not clear. And it's clear that our existing societies can't continue the way that simply the way they are. And we are in the transition period. One could name the different aspects of transition in this period. In other words, one could name what today is very different from 50 years ago and 100 years ago. And the way the opportunity for everyone to have a high standard of living and a very long life is actually there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. We've reached about midday, which is formal point of finishing this session. I'm still aware there are people online who may want to ask some questions, however. If anybody wants to take up any other points, can you read it out?
Well, there's someone who wants to speak. Can you unmute yourself?
Hello.
Das kommt da.
Yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I second the point everyone else has made about the contribution of critique in understanding the USSR in a different way from the standard Trotskyist Stalinist conceptions. I came across critique in the early 90s when I was writing my MPhil dissertation on Marxist understandings of the political economy of the USSR under Jeff Pilling at Middlesex University. And he warned me that the USSR might not be around by the time I finished my dissertation. And he was right. At the time, I read almost everything that Ticktin had written. And my question is really about, so as far as I can tell, Ticktin was always very insistent that his analysis applied only to the USSR. I was wondering how he would see the other social formations in Eastern Europe and other places during that period. Can we look at the social form of extracting the surplus product in those countries in the same way as Ticktin did with the USSR? And extending that, how would he see the current regime in Russia, and also by extension those other countries in Eastern Europe and China? I mean, are the class structures in those countries today a residue to a greater or lesser extent of the Stalinist regimes in those countries, or can they be called capitalist countries today? And what is the process unfolding today? Is it some kind of primitive accumulation or something else? Thank you.
Thanks very much. There's about 10 questions there. Thanks.
Thanks.
All good ones. Hillel, I might just turn to you because I think people, probably do want to go to lunch soon. So why not just focusing on the one question, Hillel?
Okay.
At the very beginning, because we're going to deal with what follows from the end of the Soviet Union. We'll deal with that, I think, more this afternoon. I'll open up some conversation on that, and then we can open up for a wider discussion. What's the legacy of what we've been talking about over the last many years? But why not just focusing on that one question now? I mean, is yours just specific to the USSR, and how could one apply it then to the formations which were created by the USSR effectively, weren't they, in Central and Eastern Europe before the collapse? Maybe focusing on that, leave what's happened and China maybe to this afternoon, if possible. Hillel, do you want to just address that one question?
Okay, I'll answer that. I can't really answer it fully since I don't know enough of all these countries. Yes, it's a very good question, in fact. In the case of Eastern Europe, I think we have to look at it in its process since Eastern Europe was freed from the Soviet Union. And what we see is a measure of growth, but it's limited. And they appear to be very discontented at the failure of the West to help them. They've been explicit about that. And it's true that Eastern Europe isn't comparable to Western Europe still. And what's happening is, say, France sends its parts of a car down to Czech Republic or to Poland, where it is assembled. So, and the fact that Poland had more forms of production which have ceased to exist means that in fact these countries, although they are the standard of living is rising, they are, from a production point of view, less developed there than they were, or they've moved in a particular direction which isn't the full acquisition of the kind of means of production existing in Britain or France or Germany. And as far as I have read articles expressing that content, very discontent, very clearly. Well, one can see the discontent in part in Poland by the nature of the government they've got. It's a far-right government. And I think the election's about to take place. And it's very clear that there's a strong opposition to it, but nonetheless, they've got a majority. So the answer has to be a complex answer to the question you've asked. They are not going in the direction of socialism, that's clear. On the other hand, they're finding that capitalism they're using isn't enough. And the question then is, at what point in the future, it's obviously not going to be tomorrow, they will try to find an alternative, a genuine socialist alternative, in other words, for the majority. But at the moment, it's clear that they're trying to find an alternative. The government before the present government, which has been there for some time, was, of course, a fairly right-wing government. And it doesn't seem as if it's likely to get a majority. So it's actually in a void as far as I can see. Poland receives a subsidy from the EU, a very considerable subsidy. I think it's at least, last time I looked, it was something like 10 billion. So it's being subsidized by the West in order to exist, even in that form. There are, of course, considerable differences, almost a fight between the government in Poland and the rest, Britain and France, etc. So yes, it's not working. In other words, the standard of living has risen, but in terms of development, it's got a considerable way to go. As I said, there is an explicit complaint. I don't have it with me, so I can't. But there have been explicit complaints about how Eastern Europe is being treated by Western Europe. So in one sense, it's not working. In another sense, of course, it is. The standard of living did rise. And of course, there isn't the same degree of internal control. Although in Hungary, I don't know. the Hungary now relates more to Russia. So I think that's a reflection of what I just said. They don't really know where to go to get a rise, a standard of living which will rise faster than the one they've got. In other words, it's not likely to last, but it might last a decade or two in Eastern Europe. Depends obviously on the country. The Czech Republic again is another issue where there've been different there's been a different party in power in various periods of the last 30 years, including, I have to say, one person who was very close to critique. He was actually a member of the government in Czechoslovakia at one point, still in some sense on the left. So it depends on each country what everyone's talking about, but in general, it is true that these countries are inherently unstable. And while they don't want Stalinism, they want a higher standard of living than they've actually got. And yeah. Well, Poland, of course, is the largest of them, having a population of 38 million, I think. So yeah, it's a good question as to where they're going. In relation to China, I don't know enough about China to give a genuine answer to that. I think I would have to read a lot more. Well, I've never been to China, but my impression is that the Chinese have come to a crossroad where they look very much as if they moving towards some kind of explicit capitalism, in which they introduce perhaps more obvious capitalist forms. But at the moment, the majority of the companies and most of production is produced by firms which are private. It's true they're under control, and it's also true that there's a very, very substantial public sector. And of course, the Communist Party is in control, not the capitalist class. Interestingly, the number of billionaires in China is equal to the number of billionaires in the United States. This simply amounts to a paradox. What on earth is it? Well, obviously, they are not Trotskyists, and they continue to have, a university which teaches Marxism, a Marxist university, and at least one person who's been to critique conferences is teaching in that. This person belonged to IMG, and he's teaching in that university, in the whatever the title is in Chinese, or translated Chinese. So it's a paradox. I don't know where it's going, except that it's quite clearly not going in one direction. The way it has gone in the last 10 to 20 years is undoubtedly towards capitalism, and a more efficient capitalism, and it has, as the newspapers keep repeating, they are reaching the point of being competitive in total production with the United States. I'd say they have the second biggest production in the world. That is the case. Well, the only way I can answer it is that I don't know, but the kind of pointers are that firstly, we are living in this transition period. And what one can talk about the different forms of transition throughout the world. And the Chinese are in a particular form of that transition. Secondly, a shift to capitalism, full capitalism, the abolition of a communist party, etc., would be a very difficult shift and could easily mean a civil war, terrorism, or whatever, which no doubt would restrict people. The fact that it has lasted so long, since 1949, making it moving in the direction of being lasting longer than the Soviet Union, seems to indicate that it could continue. But as the forces of production are actually developing, and the possibility of the population getting a genuinely higher standard of living, it could begin to move in a left-wing direction. What people don't seem to realize is the percentage of the population who are still peasants. China is not comparable to the other countries which we've been talking about. The last time I saw the statistic was something like close to 40% of the population are on farms. Of course, the percentage of the farmers also work in industry. But the point is, and although the exact statistic is not clear, the statistic is high. Percentage, in other words, who are not in industry but are in farming or living in farming areas, is high. So in that respect, it is it is difficult to imagine exactly how it would change. What farmers would vote for, I don't know, in that context. And in fact, if it were to break up, one would imagine there would be quite a few parties, and it would be a scramble. And I think
we're going to bring, if you want to bring your comments to an end now, because we've kind of run over time.
Okay, well, I'm finished.
That's it. Okay, we end with Chinese to the farmers. Okay, look, we're going to break now. we're going to have a couple of hours for break, and so we'll reassemble just after 2 o'clock, I suppose, for everybody here in the room. And what we're going to do this afternoon, as I said, build on some of the questions and issues that Hillel has posed there about where are we now? I mean, I think Mike said it earlier on. Some form of Stalinism, modernized form of it still exists. China is a very good example of that, I would have thought. What's going on in Russia, I think, is still a very good form of that as well. So something died, but something lived on. So I think, therefore, what we're going to do is something to try and draw out what those legacies actually mean. Hillel, I think we should say thank you to you, all the way from Glasgow, not only for what you wrote 50 years ago and continue to write. But you're still talking a lot of great stuff. So I want to put our hands together and say thanks to Hillel Ticktin.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. Right.
Hi, Hillel.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Right. Okay.